Welcome. I want to begin today by thanking GaBI for co-hosting this event with ASBM, and especially acknowledge Lazia Tong's work that she has done in order to put this together. She has really worked tirelessly, and it takes a lot of effort to put together a webinar like this. We brought together an incredible group of speakers today to discuss an extremely important topic. In a moment, Steve Strani will go through their bios. I want to thank everyone for their time and their efforts. In particular, I want to acknowledge that two of my former colleagues who were instrumental in creating Part D and implementing it, Thomas Barker, who I had the privilege of working with for 6 years at the Department of Health and Human Services during the creation and implementation of Part D, and Chuck Clapton, who I worked with on the Hill, but was a leading health staffer when it was passed. I think helped bring a very unique perspective as we talk about the changes that the IRA brings to Part D. At the end of the day, it's important to acknowledge that the IRA really builds on policy discussions that go back years. They go back really to the creation of Part D itself. And while you'll hear and you've heard a lot about price negotiation, what we would consider price setting, it was certainly considered at the time we were in the process of setting up Part D. And it was rejected for, I think, a lot of the reasons that you will hear from the panelists and the presenters today. While it focuses primarily on price, it really does not look at value. It does not look at outcomes. And ultimately, there are likely to be a lot of negative effects from this legislation. And again, we're going to discuss them both during the presentations and during the panel discussion afterwards. In reality, what we are concerned about in terms of the impact of the IRA is patients and the impact it has on the patient community. And so we believe and have been ASBM for more than 12 years, have been educating the patient community, and we're going to do so with regards to the IRA and the impact it will have on the patient community. As of today, we launched a microsite, irapatientinfo.org. You see that on there. That is on our website, and will be, we hope, one of the centers of information on those provisions and those aspects of IRA and developments that impact the patient community. In the coming weeks, we will announce a second webinar, which examines other aspects of the IRA and its impact. And again, we see this as a very long, ongoing effort in order to educate the public on something that really has is under the radar right now with regards to the impact that it's going to have on the patient community.
I appreciate having the opportunity to speak to everyone today. I'm going to start off by talking about the creation of Medicare Part D. But I think it's important as we talk about this to put it in some historical context. How has Congress in the past dealt with price controls in the Medicare and Medicaid program? So Steve mentioned that I started my career in health policy working on Capitol Hill. And so I'm going to tap into that experience and that historical context to help sort of set the stage for this discussion. So I want to start off with that background. Then I want to turn to fast forward a few decades to 2003, to the enactment of the Medicare Modernization Act and how the MMA took a different approach to price controls and controlling spending in the Medicare program, in the Part D program. Next, I want to talk about how the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, the so-called IRA, undoes the approach that was adopted in the MMA to controlling drug prices. And then last, what will be the effect of the new system? So let's start off with this discussion. So historical context, again, going back 4 decades now, and this is when I started my career in health policy, back in 1983. But even going back before that, since the enactment of Medicare and Medicaid in 1965, Congress and the executive branch have always wrestled with the question, how do we control healthcare spending in the Medicare and Medicaid programs? And in 1983, Congress and the Reagan administration agreed on a new payment system that was initially focused on hospital inpatient services, and it was designed to control costs, the so-called Inpatient Prospective Payment System, or IPPS. And that was the genesis for Congress attempting and the administration attempting to control costs in the Medicare program. And so with that initial legislation, the IPPS in 1983, then Congress and subsequent administrations adopted similar payment models between 1987 and 1997 for other classes of providers. These changes didn't really affect drug pricing, but they did affect virtually every other class of providers: hospitals, physicians, home health, skilled nursing facilities, dialysis. Congress really tried, and subsequent administrations really tried, to control spending through price control mechanisms. But the experience was that these payment models really failed to meaningfully control costs. So, for example, Medicare payments to hospitals in 1980 were $36 billion. By 2021, a couple of years ago, they'd grown to $450 billion. That is an increase of 1,150%. During that 4-decade period, by contrast, core inflation rose by 280%. So we can see that spending on Medicare payments to hospitals alone, leaving aside physicians, home health, skilled nursing, dialysis, payments to hospitals alone increased 5 times faster than core inflation. This during a period that Congress had imposed price control mechanisms on inpatient hospital payments. And so we can see by this statistic alone that the price control, cost control mechanisms that had been adopted really had not been effective in meaningfully controlling costs. For virtually every category of Medicare services, as I mentioned, and I went through them and I'll say them again: hospital inpatient services, hospital outpatient services, physician services, home health, skilled nursing, dialysis. The government strictly regulates pricing. The government sets a rate of payment, and providers have to accept that payment rate as a condition of participating in the Medicare program. So, as I'll say in a second, the IRA uses the misleading phrase price negotiation. There is no price negotiation in the Medicare program. It's a take it or leave it system. CMS says to hospitals, skilled nursing providers, physicians, et cetera, every year in a payment rule, they say this is what the price is going to be for each DRG, for each CPT code, for each home health service. This is what the price is going to be. Take it or leave it. As I said, there is no negotiation. It's a take it or leave it price. It is true providers have a right to comment on proposed payment policies, but at the end of the day, the government establishes a set price for each medical procedure. So the IRA uses this flowery language like, well, there's going to be price negotiation, but there's not going to be price negotiation. That term is a misnomer. It's going to be like every other payment system in the Medicare program, where CMS establishes a rate of payment and providers, Part D plans, and pharmaceutical manufacturers and biologic manufacturers will be forced to accept that price. So given the history of price controls in the Medicare program, when Congress created Part D in 2003, it had the benefit of decades of experience with healthcare provider rate setting. And there was general consensus among both political parties, going back to the Clinton administration, that if Medicare was going to adopt an outpatient prescription drug benefit, there really needed to be a new model to control prices, because government rate setting had failed to control prices in all other sectors of the healthcare marketplace. When President Bush signed Part D into law in December of 2003, the law relied on an entirely different model than the rest of Medicare. And there are really three main points that I want to make here. The first is that the benefit would be run by private insurance plans. It would not be run by the government. One can only sign up for Part D by enrolling in a private Part D plan. Second, negotiation for prices paid to pharmacies for drugs dispensed to Medicare beneficiaries would be conducted by pharmacy benefit managers and not the government. The government was not going to negotiate prices. And in fact, the MMA contained an express prohibition on both instituting a formulary for covered drugs in Part D plans and from negotiating drug prices and from interfering in negotiations between Part D plans, manufacturers, and pharmacies. And that was a key component of the MMA, the so-called non-interference clause. The federal government was not going to interfere in negotiations. Those negotiations would be done by private parties. And in fact, as we can see, again, Part D is a different model. It has been enormously successful in controlling costs. So when Part D was enacted in 2003, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that in the first decade, spending on Part D drugs would be $770 billion. In reality, in that first decade, actual expenditures were 45% lower, or $421 billion. Part D average monthly premiums in 2023, this year, are $32. In 2006, the average monthly Part D premium was also $32. But by contrast, the average monthly premium for Part B of the Medicare program in 2006 was $88.50. It's $165 this year. So we can see that although the premium for Part D plans has generally been held flat for the past 2 decades, the premium for fee-for-service Medicare, where the government directly regulates and controls pricing, the premium has almost doubled in that 2-decade period. And so what this shows, to me at least, is that the private marketplace is far more effective at controlling costs, both for the government and for Medicare beneficiaries. As I said a few moments ago, the IRA drug, quote unquote, negotiation process, it's not going to be a negotiation at all. It is simply going to substitute government rate setting with private market negotiations that have been enormously successful in limiting premiums and Part D expenditures. And really, all that the IRA, the so-called IRA does, it is simply the European version of price controls. Government rate setting of Medicare payments for other services has not been successful in controlling Medicare spending over the past 4 decades. And so there's no reason to believe that a government-run rate setting process will be at all successful in lowering program costs. We can use all these flowery words like there's going to be negotiation. The term negotiation implies that there's back and forth, there's going to be give and take. There's not going to be negotiation. It is going to become a government-run rate-setting process, and it is not going to be successful in lowering program costs. The Part D benefit redesign that was included in the IRA, it is true, that will provide benefits for enrollees, but those benefits have nothing to do with the drug price negotiation provisions of the law. So I'm going to stop there. Has Chuck joined us yet?
I think, Tom, we're going to ask you to go ahead and work through your second set of slides.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. If we can bring up the second set. So what I'd like to talk about now is to amplify a point that I made a few moments ago, which is that drug price negotiation, it's really European price controls. And what does that mean for the patient? So the first thing that it means is there's going to be a reduction in innovation. Manufacturers will be less likely to invest in new breakthrough therapies because the incentive for them to do so, the profit incentive that's built into the system, that's going to go away in the IRA. And even worse, I've heard that some members of Congress are proposing to apply the price negotiation process in the IRA to launch prices of innovative products. If we can make one positive statement about the IRA, we can say that it only applies to existing drugs, but there are some members of Congress that would like to apply the policy to launch prices of new innovative products, and that would further hinder innovation. The second effect that it's going to have is really more on the Medicare program, the effect on premiums. So it seems counterintuitive that government price setting is going to cause premiums to increase, but the experience in the other parts of Medicare shows that that is exactly what happens. In my last deck, I used the example of Medicare Part B premiums. Medicare Part B pays for physician services, durable medical equipment, hospital outpatient services. All of those services the prices are strictly regulated by the federal government, and premiums have increased for those services beyond the inflation rate over the past 20 years. And as I demonstrated, Part D premiums have not increased over the past 20 years. And so it does seem counterintuitive, right? You think, oh, the government's going to regulate and cap prices, and it's going to be very aggressive in limiting the prices that manufacturers can charge. So that's got to mean that that's going to lower costs for beneficiaries. But the experience with other parts of Medicare is that that is not true. As I said, Part D premiums have been essentially flat over the years, while premiums in other parts of Medicare have increased at the rate of inflation or higher. Further, we cannot look at this in a vacuum. There are other factors at play that are likely to increase Part D spending. And so top-line statistics are going to show that Part D program costs have increased far more rapidly than in prior years. And I have 3 examples here. So the first is the new GLP agonists. They're going to drive program spending. There have been a plethora of articles in the mainstream media over prescriptions for GLP agonists and how they are increasing because people are using them for weight loss. Now, it is true that Medicare Part D prohibits spending on drugs for weight loss. But what's going to happen is, and what is already happening, is physicians are prescribing these drugs for A1C control for diabetics and pre-diabetics. And that trend is going to increase as more people want to start to use those drugs for weight loss. And that's going to increase Part D spending. There's another factor at play, the new Alzheimer's agents. Now, the new Alzheimer's agents that have been approved by the FDA in the past couple of months, those are Part B drugs, not Part D. But over time, they're going to get reformulated as Part G drugs. They're going to drive program spending. And the same thing is going to happen with the new gene and cell therapies that are being approved and are going to start to be approved. They are going to get reformulated as Part G drugs. They're going to drive program spending. So although there is this backdrop of price controls in the IRA that will be said to lower Part D program spending, they won't. And there are other factors at play that are also going to increase Part D program spending. And so I'm going to wrap up now, Steve, if I may. And I see Chuck, this is perfect timing. I see that you are now joining us. This is perfect timing. I'm going to wrap up by making 3 points. First of all, government price setting in the Medicare and Medicaid programs has historically been ineffective in controlling program costs. As Steve said in his very kind introduction to me, I've been involved in healthcare public policy for 4 decades, going back to the early 1980s. And I have seen over that time that government price setting and government rate controls has historically been ineffective in controlling program costs. By contrast, the free market approach that was adopted by Chuck and his colleagues on the Hill in the early 2000s, the free market approach adopted on the enactment of Part D 20 years ago has clearly demonstrated the superiority of a private market approach to Medicare spending. Government rate setting, my third and final point, government rate setting of prescription drug prices will hinder innovation, and it is going to ultimately harm patients. So I'm going to conclude my remarks there. I'd be happy to take questions when Steve moderates the panel discussion at the end of the program. But right now, I'm going to turn it over to Michael's and my friend and colleague, Chuck Clapton, who, as Michael mentioned in his introduction, was working on the Hill and was in a key leadership role on Capitol Hill in 2003 when Congress passed Part D and when President Bush, George W. Bush signed Part D into law. So Chuck, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tom. Let me start by apologizing.
Well, in fact, Chuck, this is Steve. Let me do a little bit more to set the stage
Sure.
for your presentation, because we're really happy to have you here. So while Ozzy is pulling up the slides, there's a whole generation of us who, when it came time to go to the Hill to advocate on behalf of our clients, that meant going to Chuck Clapton to, in his many roles in both the House and the Senate, staffing these Medicare issues and a whole host of other healthcare issues. He has a long history of public service and policy development. Many of you may know he served also with pharma as vice president of their advocacy efforts. And now currently, he's been in a leadership position for the last 5 or 6 years with Gilead, where he runs their government affairs. So again, I can really think of no one else who can combine the experience from the public sector working on policy, along with the industry perspectives on the challenges involving investment and the development of new molecules. So with that, Chuck?
Thank you for the kind words, and thanks, Steve, and Tom as well. Despite all that experience, apparently one of the skills I do not possess is how to figure out the basics of IT. So I apologize for the delay and the confusion. We had been planning to do this from my laptop in my office, but as you can see, I'm doing it from my phone. So I may ask Lazia for her help advancing the slides, since I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do that from my phone. So again, following up on Tom's remarks, I just want to give a little bit of context and background about both where we started with Part D, but also more importantly, where IRA is going to go in terms of these new price controls. So as Tom noted, the Medicare Modernization Act that created Part D was passed, and the intent behind it was to create a market-based alternative to government price setting. It established a program where private plans would negotiate with manufacturers and provide competing choices for patients that allowed beneficiaries to choose the plan that best met their need, in stark contrast to the various price control regimes that exist in the rest and other parts of Medicare that Tom described. Part D was very successful, particularly if you look at the metric that we often use, both when I was on the Hill and then in the private sector, in terms of keeping premiums relatively flat. In fact, far low at premiums have increased or even decreased at a rate that no one really would have predicted. I think we have to acknowledge, however, at the same time, while premiums have remained flat, for some beneficiaries, they have faced a significant increase in out-of-pocket costs. Next slide, please. So in terms of how we got to the situation we're in that led to the passage of IRA, another factor I want to talk briefly about is this is a longer problem that has existed for a long time. It has become particularly acute in the past few years. But again, prior to the enactment of the Medicare Modernization Act, many other countries, particularly those in the OECD, have implemented significant price controls on innovative medicines. Now, these price controls have achieved significant discounts that are often well below the prices that are available in the United States. Next slide, please. Now, at the same time, these price controls have also resulted in patients in those countries facing severe limitations on access to innovative new medicines. This includes both drugs not being approved, as well as coverage not being provided for significant periods of time after those same drugs were available in the United States. It's obviously a terrible outcome for patients, but I would argue is a logical outgrowth of some of the price control policies that have been put in place. I will also say that one of the frustrations on a bipartisan basis from U.S. lawmakers, these price controls have established a dynamic where the total cost of developing new innovative medicines has been shifted. So the U.S. healthcare system, patients, and U.S. taxpayers are bearing an ever greater share of total R&D costs across the industry. Next slide, please. So those two factors, I would say, in combination, the increase in out-of-pocket liability for many beneficiaries and this anger over ex-U.S. prices really has led to the situation we faced last year, which ultimately was the Inflation Reduction Act being enacted in July, August of 2022. I'll talk very briefly. There are three main components to focus on with regard to drug pricing in the Inflation Reduction Act. There is the inflation penalty that imposes a cap on the level of price increases that manufacturers can take. It also redesigned the Part D benefit in a variety of ways. One of the intents was specifically to address that out-of-pocket issue. But the third element, and we're going to focus most of my presentation on, was a mechanism that would allow the government to negotiate prices. Next slide, please. Now, again, I want to clarify, negotiation is a poll-tested phrase that was used because the average layperson, when they hear negotiation, thinks, of course, the government should negotiate. It isn't really negotiation. What will happen is, as Tom said, the government is going to essentially set the price. So we known as a maximum fair price, and it's going to apply for a subset of drugs without generic or biosimilar competition. The way the bill was enacted, it will apply this negotiation for small molecule drugs, think drugs that are approved under an NDA, at 9 years. And then for biologic drugs, they're going to be subject to negotiation after 13 years. And I know a couple of the other speakers are going to go into more detail on this, but this is not tied in any way to the reality of existing patents or this current system that many patients and advocates know through Hatch-Waxman. This was an arbitrary set of dates that were picked by the drafters of the bill. And frankly, we've been spending a fair bit of time trying to even understand what the rationale was behind how they ended up with 9 and 13, because as I'm going to talk about, it leads to some what I hope are unintended consequences, but very real impacts on the future of drug development. So with regard to negotiation mechanism, it will start in 2026. 10 Medicare Part D drugs will be subject to negotiation. By 2030, that will have expanded to include both Part D, which again, think small tablet drugs that you take, that you would get from a pharmacy, as well as Part B, which are primarily physician-injected drugs. By 2030, 80 drugs are going to be subject to negotiation, which will include the B and D. And again, this last point goes back to why negotiation is a misnomer. The idea, the concept of negotiation would suggest that it is a true inter-party dealing between two parties where either has the ability to walk away from the negotiation. That isn't what this is. The U.S. government has the ability under the IRA for any manufacturer that chooses not to accept the quote-unquote negotiated price, they're going to face significant tax penalties. In fact, it's an excise tax that will rise up to 95% of the total revenues of the drug, which essentially will compel any manufacturer to have to participate in this negotiated price mechanism. Next slide, please. The next thing I want to talk about is the negotiation process. So again, it's a misnomer to describe it as a negotiation. What's going to happen is manufacturers are going to be required to submit several specified types of data. The secretary will look at that data and then make determinations as to what they think the price of the drug should be. So again, the things that the secretary or manufacturers will have to submit: R&D costs and what is estimated for the recoupment of those costs for that particular drug, the unit costs of production or cost of goods, distribution costs. Was there any federal financial support for novel therapeutic discovery and development? So here, did NIH make any investments, or were there other federal grants involved in the development of medicine? Were there any other additional FDA recognized exclusivity periods? And market data and revenue, which would include also sales volume. So Again, the secretary will take all of this information and look at it. A couple of other things to note, particularly for folks who are more familiar with HTA-based systems in the EU. There is essentially no real requirement that the secretary have any engagement with patients and patient perspectives. The secretary is voluntarily undertaking some of that now, but there are no formal requirements that specify that the patient voice has to be heard anywhere in this negotiation process. Negotiation is also not required to go through any type of rulemaking. This is all done through sub-regulatory guidance, which I would point stands in stark contrast, as Tom talked about, the implementation of the original Part D benefit, which the secretary had to go through a formal rulemaking process where interested parties were able to submit comments, and those comments had to be taken into account. The new law exempts the negotiation process from judicial review. So even if it is arbitrary or violative of basic due process requirements, unless there's a constitutional claim, judicial review is precluded. And again, I would note that this stands in marked contrast to some of the existing requirements for patient engagement that are present in many of the European price control systems that I know one of the other speakers will elaborate on. So next slide, please. So what does this all mean? So as a starting point, we know that the Congressional Budget Office has estimated the drug pricing provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act will save the federal government $237 billion over the next 10 years. There continues to be, however, significant uncertainty as to what the actual negotiated prices would look like. I'm going to talk about several of the reports that have been done that have looked independently at this. But I will say that even within the biopharmaceutical industry, there is a wide array of opinions as to how steep these negotiations will be. Again, where I anchor to in terms of what has been driving this legislation, ultimately a significant factor is going to be the anger on a bipartisan basis over some of the international reference prices. I think particularly if you look at some of the more progressive members of Congress, here I'd note Chairman Bernie Sanders of the Health Committee, Senator Elizabeth Warren, have been sharply critical of drug pricing. And I would expect they're going to put significant pressure on the Biden administration through this negotiation process to drive these negotiated prices as low as they possibly can. So what does that mean? I want to talk very briefly just about a couple of reports that have been issued that have analyzed both the negotiation mechanism and then what it could mean in the long run for drug development. So Vital Transformations, which is a research-based organization, worked very closely with the trade association Bio. They've also subsequently worked with pharma as well to issue multiple reports. The one I'll reference, Vital Transformations found that the IRA price controls, when implemented, will result in as many as 139 drugs over the next 10 years not being developed. In addition, academic researchers, including Thomas Phillipson, who's at the University of Chicago, he also served in a senior role during the prior administration in the White House. He conducted research that showed that there'd be a similar impact on the development of new drugs. Similarly, the investor community, particularly the venture capital community, that's been a major funder of especially smaller biotech companies, has been working through a coalition called No Patient Left Behind. No Patient Left Behind has shared public analyses that have showed where their investors are already starting to see behavioral effects in terms of where they're going to make investment. And that is going to discourage investments in certain types of drugs. Next slide, please. So in terms of where these impacts are likely to be, where we know it's really three main areas that have been identified today. The first goes to what I referenced, the 9 years for small molecule versus 13 years. Again, I think it's important to note, manufacturers will not stop being innovative companies. They will continue to develop new drugs. But what's going to happen is they're going to have to make hard choices. One of the choices based on the perverse incentives built into the IRA is that many have projected that manufacturers will start to move away from it, making future investments in small molecule drugs and tend to make more investments in areas like biologics because they have that longer period of negotiation. Another area where manufacturers will be disincentivized to make investments will be for subsequent indications for already approved drugs. Again, think of a drug like Keytruda, or many drugs in the cancer oncology space, where the typical model for drug development usually is you start with a very small patient indication with a high level of unmet medical need. And then once you have that approval, you transition to move to earlier lines of treatment or larger indications in patient diseases. And that system is currently rewarded under Hatch-Waxman because you can get additional periods of exclusivity for those additional clinical trials and indications you gained. Under the IRA, there's a hard cap. So for a small molecule drug used to treat glioblastoma, once you've got that indication, that 9 years starts to toll. And as a result, manufacturers will be disincentivized from performing additional clinical trials on that compound to see if it could have potential efficacy to treat other forms of cancer. The other area that has already been highlighted will be the IRA is going to discourage investments in rare diseases. And here I'd point to the work of some of the coalitions, including the Rare Access Advocacy Project, or RAP, that's done significant work showing how the IRA is already negatively impacting investments in rare diseases. Next slide. Tom touched on this briefly, but in terms of where we look ahead, I wish I could say that the IRA was the end, but unfortunately it feels more like the beginning. We are already seeing the Biden administration, as part of its fiscal year 2024 budget, has already proposed accelerating and expanding the IRA price controls. Under the Biden budget, this would take those price controls and apply negotiation at 5 years for both small molecule and biologics. And it would also increase the number of drugs subject to negotiation. A parallel bill has been introduced in the Senate called the SMART Act, which has already received 28 Democratic co-sponsors. The other thing I would note that is probably my greatest concern, with IRA, it has created a price control mechanism for both Part B and Part D drugs. In the long run, we know that budgetary pressures are going to create strong pressure on Congress and future administrations to further expand these price controls, ultimately to the point where they would apply at launch, which are going to then further exacerbate the negative and unintended consequences on drug development. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Steve, and happy to answer any questions at the end.
Super. Well, thank you so much, Chuck. Well, one of the core issues, and we've touched upon this, is in setting fair and adequate pricing policy is to really understand the costs of drug development and what drives investors to commit the tremendous funding numbers that are necessary. Dr. Steve Potts is a biotech drug developer at the International Cancer Advocacy Network. He has over 20 years of experience as a biotech entrepreneur, including work with small molecules, complex cell therapies, and biologicals. He has contributed to 2 approved drugs, and perhaps even more interesting to hear about will be the larger number of molecules that he's worked on that have not reached approval. He has held many leadership positions in founding companies and managing large drug development initiatives. He has raised billions of dollars over the course of his career in venture capital funding. And he holds a PhD in biological engineering and an MBA. We're all very interested to hear what you have to add to the discussion, Dr. Potts.
Thanks again, Steve. What a great, opportunity to go after some of the other speakers. And I want to focus today on 2 things, really. One is it's been about a year since IRA passed. So we're in July, about July of last year. And then, what damage are we already seeing? And what data do we have that there's already been an impact? And then secondly, and this is maybe provocative where I don't have concrete answers, is how do we measure the next couple of years ongoing damage? And if you don't measure something, and I'm a scientist, we don't measure it, kind of doesn't exist. And so I want to kind of focus our thoughts on that. What data is out there today in the last year that shows damage, and then how we think about measuring the impact of this going forward. There's really two big funding groups. The government does fund drug development, but it's a much lower amount than these other two groups. One is large pharma companies, and then the others is venture. And it's obviously difficult. No one's going to be invited into any company developing drugs in this competitive environment. So you're not going to see insights into how people think in a boardroom when they make investments, based on what happens with an act like IRA. The venture side is more interesting because those of us that are entrepreneurs are out there. We're fundraising. Just as an example, my last company I raised $75 million. I had about 100 no's for every one yes. That's how it works. I had an article I wrote kind of for the general public called it Shark Tank for Nerds. So it is a process of raising money, and so you do get a lens into how venture at least thinks, and how venture reacts to things like IRA. I want to use today specifically the penalty, the difference between the 13 years of when price control starts with biologics versus 9 years with small molecules. And I think this is a good example of a few things. Number one is it clearly shows negotiation is the wrong word. And, I'm not a policy person. I'm a drug developer. I've been doing this 25 years. Like the introduction said, I've been involved in 2 successful drugs, and I can't tell you how many that haven't worked. So I certainly would welcome, if the government is going to look at cost, that would be great. Let's also add the cost of the very small chance, even the first 1 out of 10 drugs that makes your first clinical trial, only one of those even gets approved, and that's before the hundreds probably don't even make it to the first in human trial. So cost would be great if you would account for how risky and the odds likelihood of what we do. And so my career is an example of that. In 25 years, I've been involved in 2 successful drugs, and then a whole ton that haven't. And frankly, a lot of my peers, 2 is probably a good place to hang up I'm mid-career, but 2 successful drugs is about a good average for a 40-year drug developer life of contribution. I have a few slides. Let's see, and I don't know if I should advance these or do you want me to share my screen?
How about that? You want me to put
perfect. Yes. Yeah, you got it. Okay, great. And then shall I just ask you to advance? That's good. But let's hold it right here. So the last summer I was out fundraising, and I've been involved in small molecules. I've been involved in some very complex biologics. I fundraised for an oncolytic virus, which is about as complex as you can get. But I was fundraising last summer, really a few months after the act passed. And I kind of noticed sort of anecdotally less interest in small molecules. I had some anecdotal conversations with some, very top venture funds. They said, Steve, is there any way to look at this problem with a biologic? Can you do an injection versus a pill? And I just was thinking, are you kidding me? Like from a patient standpoint, like does anybody on this call, ever want to take an injectable versus a pill? I mean, it's so backwards from how what we think is the best, approach just for delivering medicine, and also of course it's the small molecules where you have the prices just drop once they come off patent, because, there's very little, it's very little barriers to making a competitive, small drug than there is versus a biologic. So those were kind of comments, and they got me thinking. I was like, am I the only one seeing this impact already? I had a really honor to work with No Patients Left Behind, which is a really wonderful organization. A lot of volunteer work by a number of people in the venture community, and one of their big focuses has been on this 9 versus 13-year impact. And so I was encouraged to think about maybe doing a survey and trying to get quantitative data on this. And if I use an analogy here, think of a typical cancer clinical trial. So the first thing you work for 5-6 years to actually get it first in human. And you then have really anecdotes. You get it in a couple patients, you see response, you're trying to dose escalation, but all you have is really a few, almost just case studies based on how the drug is doing. Then you start to do a phase 1, and you'll get dozens of patients, and you start to have a little bit of preliminary data. And then if that's successful, then you have a phase 2 and a phase 3 and ultimately approval. And it takes about a 4 to 6 year process from first in human to actual approval. 1 out of 10 of those actually work. So if I use that analogy for on a negative way and say, okay, IRA Act came out in summer of 2022. How do we measure how the impact over the next 4 to 6 years of this policy? And so what we're seeing, initially was some anecdotes. So you saw some large pharmas with press releases saying, we're getting out of that business because it just doesn't make sense to develop small molecules for the elderly when you're cutting off basically half of the opportunity to make, to have profits come back. You see anecdotes there. You saw my first anecdotes, on the other side of that as a small biotech entrepreneur raising money. The next thing is really like, phase 1 data sets. So, were there any data sets we could create to kind of look at this and see, is there already being impact? And here are 2 that came out, mine and then another one that I'll show from BioCentury that came out around the same time. And so what I did is I surveyed 100 venture funds. I'm out there raising money anyway, so it was easy to do that. And I kept it very simple. I asked really two main questions. Are you experiencing changes in funding for small molecules versus biologics as a result of the IRA, as a direct result of the IRA? And the bottom line here is that I think it was 85%. So this is 1 out of 7, 6 out of 7 of venture funds are seeing significant decrease in interest in funding small molecules for large populations because of direct result of the IRA. So that was pretty astonishing. And go back to think about, when you're fundraising and you can expect, 50 to 100 no's for when you finally get your money together, to launch a new venture. And then think it's 6 out of 7 of those funders are saying, we're out of it. We're out of this space. I mean, that's pretty almost jaw-dropping. My second question was, okay, regardless of IRA, put that on the side for a minute. How do small molecules compare to antibodies in terms of development and approval risk? And this kind of goes back to, I did the same thing that Chuck did, trying to figure out where did 9 years versus 13 years come from? And it literally came from nowhere. I mean, it must have been invented in a backroom discussion because I try to track it. There's absolutely nothing nothing logical that you can hang your hat on for any reason why there was a difference in treatment. But there was certainly a few people that said, oh, well, small molecules are easy, they're less risky, et cetera, et cetera. Well, those of us in development, do not think that way. And so I wanted to quantify that as well. And basically it's half and half. If you're a small molecule drug developer, you probably think the grass is greener in biologics. And if you're a biologic drug developer, you probably think there's less risky in small molecules. But the point here is one is not easier than the other. They're both tools that we need, desperately need in areas like cancer and in neuroscience. You need both of these in your toolkit. So that was my survey. That came out in March, about 100 VCs, and clearly 6 out of 7 VCs are polling out have already been impacted by this. Let's go to the next slide. So another one that was really nice that was run by BioCentury, and I really applaud them for being ahead of the curve here. They did kind of about a similar survey and ran this as well, asked different questions. And I'm going to use the next few slides just to sort of, I think, help frame the various ways that a legislative decision making impacts what is a very long planning session, for developing new drugs. So next slide, I'll just walk through a few of these because they did a nice job kind of pointing out some of the impacts. So, orphan drug designation, there's a number of small companies say, well, if we just get one orphan drug in the market, that's good enough. And then basically, we want to exit to large pharma anyway. So it's not going to immediately impact us. But, you certainly see that you're going to get, instead of thinking orphan drug as a start, as you get one approval in a pyramid kind of a setting, and then work your way to broader populations with more orphan drug designations. You can see here the impact is like you may not want to go beyond one orphan drug because of IRA. Next slide. This is really a concern. The starting in small indications will fall out of favor. And, it's one thing to say, well, obviously, if you're going to only give me 9 years in which to recoup money, I'm going to have to go after the largest indication possible. That's fine to say that, but in cancer doesn't work that way. And neuroscience increasingly doesn't work that way. I mean, what you're seeing in neuroscience drug development is what you see we've been doing in cancer for the last 30 years, which is basically going after individual small populations and tumors, figuring out how the drug works, and then expanding from there. And we're seeing that same trend in Alzheimer's is a great example there. But you really can't do that. You're not incentivized to do that now. You basically have to somehow think about what's the biggest population I can use this new drug on and go there. And so you can see it's a huge disincentive to come up with a really new MOA and then also try to play a game of saying, I'm going to apply this to this massive, patient population. It's very unlikely to work. So while we are going to see these small indications fall out of favor, the reality is that it's incredibly difficult to try to forecast and plan for a novel mechanism in a large population in Alzheimer's or across many different kinds of tumors. Next slide. And I liked how BioCentury called out a few of these here, and we're certainly living this. The disincentive, for example, of encouraging trials for new indications late in the window before price setting. At the last slide I have is some resources, and I had a really nice interview with Dr. Rafael Fonseca, who has been a longtime leader in multiple myeloma, and he said, Steve, what we have done in myeloma is typically applied these drugs that get approved in other areas and we take them into myeloma. That's been a standard practice in small molecules. That's going to go out the window. And he said, I'm really worried about that, because why would somebody risk IRA, getting under IRA and applying this into it in a smaller area like a multiple myeloma? So that's another reality we're living. Next slide. So pipeline and a product. I mean, this is where, again, the whole approach, especially in oncology, but also in autoimmune, is you get approval in one small area and then you build from there, and you basically build a pipeline and a product. And this is how you get funding when you're in a venture stage and you say, look, I want to build a drug for this small niche population. The immediate next question in the boardroom, when you're raising money is, well, how are you going to expand this business? And if you say, well, or not, you can imagine what it's going to do to people actually funding this. So pipeline and a product, I mean, 2/3 of the people on the respondents thought this is going to likely become a thing of the past. Next slide. And then this, absolutely, we're living this. I mean, this isn't hard. This isn't hard math. You sit with an investor and you say, all right, the odds are low, but we've got a really good drug here. This is a really good idea. We've got great preclinical data. And by the way, I can get 13 years, which will allow me, barely to recoup my costs versus 9 years. And those last 4 years may not seem significant, but that's where all the money is made. I mean, drug development takes a long time. In medicine, it takes people a long time to change. So no matter how good a drug is, the sales always ramp up late. And so those last 4 years, you're cutting off pretty much half of the profits just by going from 9 to 13. So of course, you're going to see a shift from small molecules to biologics. And those two surveys, what I'm saying is we're already seeing this shift. The damage has already happened, and it's just going to keep happening. Next slide. So this is interesting here too, because a number of my peers, I work in an area called targeted therapy. And so there's a lot of companies, these are, typically either public or private targeted therapy companies. And, they're going after a smaller indication. So they're saying, look, we don't see this direct impact, but what maybe it's more a problem of larger pharma. So this is certainly a trend I see here. And, I may be a bit of a canary in the coal mine here, but I think you're going to see more and more of this impact as the larger pharmas start in dialoguing with the smaller biotechs, small as they are, say, look, this is impacting the price we'll pay for you, for the work you've done to date, for this drug in M&A. Next slide. So I put a few resources here, and this has, again, been sort of my journey and my lens of trying to, in the last year, put some data around what the impact has been. And so this is, again, like a cancer trial. Some of this was anecdotal. I had a few articles that I wrote, and really mostly for the lay person, to get them interested in what was going on, to understand drug development, to understand why it's risky, to understand that if you're going to cost out drug development, you better cost out how challenging it is to actually do this, and all the failures that go along with the occasional win. So there's some anecdotes in there. I have my survey and also BioCentury Survey, and there's two really good interviews that I thought were very revealing. One was with Dr. Fonseca, and the other was Dr. McEmany, one in Arizona and one in New Mexico. A lot of this also has come out with some from my view, with some really good interaction with my two state senators and their staffs, who have actually been very open to discussion. But the message has been, Steve, can you get data? And so I think, if I just zoom out a little bit, if you think about the medical device tax and, how finally that was able to be defeated, it was with data, to be able to really say, no, this has hugely hit medical device innovation. And I think I just challenge all of us to think about not just anecdotes from either large pharma, from venture, not just these two surveys, which are sort of phase 1 data sets, but how do we really think about measuring the impact? And the challenge here is that what ultimately we're talking about is a whole number of small molecule drugs across neurosciences, Alzheimer's, across a number of cancer areas, across other areas, are basically just not going to get developed. So how do you measure drugs that are not going to get developed over the next 6 to 10 years because of this IRA, unless it gets changed, particularly small molecule penalty? And how do we approach measuring that so we can have data and take that data and say, look, it is already happening and it's going to continue to happen. So that's kind of where my mind is next, is how do we build kind of the phase 2, phase 3 data set equivalents, to show what the impact really is. So thank you. Again, I'm not a policy person. I would be happy just to continue to develop drugs and leave this whole issue on the side. But the reality is it's affecting fundraising. I'm one example, but hopefully I'm a pretty clear example of what happens when investors are trying to look out 10 to 15 years and make economic predictions, when you have a governmental change that frankly is not a negotiation, they weren't included in the discussion, and then you have to adjust to that. And so you see some very adverse effects.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Potts. That was very informative. Our last speaker before we start the Q&A session is Andrew Spiegel. And most appropriately, we're going to wrap up the prepared remarks with an emphasis on the patient perspective, right? Nothing about the Medicare program or any other policies that we work on make any difference unless we are thinking first and foremost about the interests of the patients. Andrew Spiegel serves with the Global Colon Cancer Association. He has spent over 20 years in patient advocacy. He co-founded the Colon Cancer Association in the late 1990s, and he, which is a US-based advocacy group for colon cancer. He also co-founded the Global Colon Cancer Association, which is an international patient advocacy organization representing patients and colorectal cancer groups worldwide. In addition, he has chaired the fundraising committee for the International Alliance of Patient Organizations and co-founded a group called the World Patients Alliance, which is the largest patient organization worldwide. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Spiegel.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's been a really interesting panel for me. I learned a lot about the history, which I hadn't heard before, about how Medicare Part D came to be, and how all of these issues we're talking about today were talked about decades ago. I'm here to talk as the CEO of the Global Colon Cancer Association, and we are an umbrella organization of all colorectal cancer groups on the planet. By way of background, the rate of colon cancer in America for people under the age of 55 has nearly doubled since the 90s. And in fact, the data shows that in the next 7 years, colorectal cancer in the age group of 20 to 49 will be the leading cause of cancer death. And worldwide, colon cancer is about to overtake lung cancer as the leading cause of cancer death all around the world. And so this is, while many cancers are decreasing in incidence, colorectal cancer is increasing. And I've been involved in this space since really the late 1990s, when there was literally one drug for colorectal cancer. It was called 5-FU. It was highly ineffective. And essentially, if you were diagnosed with metastatic colorectal cancer in the 90s or early 2000s, it was a death sentence, and you generally died within a year. Fast forward now, we have over 30 FDA-approved drugs for colorectal cancer. And as a result, we see that people are living much longer, and we're actually using the word cure for the first time in the colorectal cancer space. And we know that things are going great now for the colorectal cancer patients because of investments that were made decades ago, made in the 90s, 80s, and early 2000s. Those investments have resulted in the drugs being released over the last decade and a half that have really made a difference in the lives of colorectal cancer patients and all cancer patients. We've seen incredible improvements in cancer care over the last decade with the introduction of the new targeted therapies and the immunotherapies and things of that nature. And what worries me so much about the Inflation Reduction Act is that you're going to take away the incentives for all of these drugs to be continued to be developed. And we know that there's two types of drugs that are critical to cancer treatment, and they're small molecule drugs and large molecule drugs, biologics and biosimilars. And I'll tell you a quick personal story about the small molecule drugs. My 47-year-old never smoking wife was diagnosed with metastatic lung cancer 3 years ago. And they knew right away that there was some mutation that must have happened because she is not the type that should get lung cancer. She never smoked, had no high risk factors. It didn't run in her family. And they were right. The doctors were right. She does have a rare mutation. But the good thing about that very rare mutation is that there were new drugs that had just come to market when she was diagnosed. And they're pills. They're called TKIs. They're small molecule pills. And my wife was able to be on one of those pills for more than a year, which had zero side effects. She lived a perfectly normal life. And despite the fact that the cancer had spread to her spine, to both lungs, to her hip, to her pelvis, it was a bad case. She had a complete response to taking a small molecule pill that had just been released. Fast forward a bit, that pill stopped working as they expected it would, and she went on almost 2 years of chemotherapy. And that chemotherapy also worked for the cancer, but it also caused significant side effects. And those significant side effects started to cause her to have early stage kidney failure. And that kidney failure was causing all types of side effects to her body. The chemo was causing incredible side effects. And the long story short is that she's now on a phase 1 clinical trial at Memorial Sloan Kettering for another one of these small molecule pills that not only has it put all of her cancer back at bay, but again, she has no side effects at all. Her kidneys are back to normal. So, let me tell you from not only my 20-some years of patient advocacy, but my personal experience over the last 3 years we need these innovative drugs to come out for cancer patients. My wife's doing great, working full-time. She's in the kitchen right now taking care of our kids and taking care of the house with stage 4 cancer that doesn't exist in her body right now because of these small molecule pills and because of the innovation that has happened over the last 20 years. So we know about the small molecule penalty. This really worries me because these new drugs that are targeted, personalized cancer drugs are small molecule drugs. And that's what works best in people's bodies, that there's literally no side effects whatsoever on this clinical trial that she's on. And we know about the Inflation Reduction Act making these drugs eligible for price controls 9 years after FDA approval, which is 4 years sooner than biologics. And I feel like those 4 years are critical for the industry that are investing in these drugs being developed. And we know that it's already over $1 billion and over a decade to bring new drugs to market. We know that most of them fail and there's great losses that come with those failures. I'm not in the business of talking about drug pricing or pharmaceutical profits or things like that. But what I know is that we need these drugs to be developed. We need to properly incentivize the manufacturers to develop the drugs because the patients need them. And it seems like we've been making incredible progress over the last couple of decades because of the investment in new drugs and new therapies. And why would we ever want to go back? It really is against the administration's own policy on the cancer moonshot. We've been very vocal advocates, and you can see one of the articles that we wrote here at ASBM, vocal advocates to fix this problem that is now a year old. So we see that the biotech companies, the major pharmaceutical companies, have already raised the alarm. I just attended ASCO in Chicago and met with 26 different pharmaceutical companies. I'm hearing the same thing from every single one of them, is that they really are, even though they're well underway of making these new drugs, they really are reconsidering their future investments in small molecule drugs as well as biological drugs. And so very alarming to the patient community as more and more patient advocates become aware of how this law will affect them. So another issue is the negotiation. It's already been talked about by many other speakers before me, so I won't get too heavily into this or the excise tax, but we know this is not a negotiation. You don't sit down with the U.S. government, the biggest payer for pharmaceuticals, and say, okay, let's go up and back and negotiate a fair price. It's not. We know it's price setting. And what bothers me about price setting is, as our earlier speaker said, when you see in Europe, those countries that have had price setting, we see that there is late access or no access to new innovative medicines. And that can mean a lot for a newly diagnosed cancer patient. I was recently on a panel with the American Cancer Society, and we were talking about this exact issue, about innovation and the importance of not delaying access to newly diagnosed cancer patients. And the American Cancer Society speaker was talking about how a triple negative breast cancer patient, when they're diagnosed, a 2-month delay in getting access to the treatment reduces their risk of surviving the disease by 50%. So you know that in almost all of the European countries, there is more than a 2-month delay. There's more than a 6-month delay in getting access to new treatments. Whereas here in the United States, we know that we're getting access to them almost immediately, within 30 to 60 days normally of when a drug is introduced. And just look at the history of drug development. We looked at Europe used to be the leader in drug development. Go back to the 1970s, and they accounted for the majority of drug development over the world. But since price controls were implemented in Europe, now 60% of new drugs are developed in the United States compared to only 13% in Switzerland, 8% in the UK, 6% in Germany and France. So price controls have really impacted drug development in Europe. And I think that's something that the US can't afford to happen here. And we know these price controls, as I said, have reduced the time to access for treatments for newly diagnosed cancer patients. Look at the data of cancer medicines launched globally over the last decade. More than 96% were available to people in the US. 65% were available to other and developed nations. That developed, not underdeveloped nations. We're talking about Australia, Japan, the UK. These major countries that have price settings, they're only getting 65% of the drugs that are available. And there's even more data out there about the delays in getting access to these drugs. So it's really a big problem when you see price controls coming into markets. Access becomes a huge problem worldwide. We had this one situation in Australia where patients lost access to a drug due to price controls in excess of what was agreed to by the government. So what happened was there were fewer choices, not more choices for patients and physicians. And this is one of the things that's not been talked about too much, is that for this whole system to work, especially with biologics and biosimilars, there must be competition. We know every industry that competition drives down prices. But what I think the IRA has done is that it has reduced competition, because who could compete with the federal government? If I'm a biosimilar manufacturer and I'm about to invest $250 or $300 million in a new biosimilar drug, but my competition is going to be competing against the United States government, who's going to set the price, I have to think twice about whether I want to make that investment in a new biosimilar drug, knowing that the government has already set what the price is that they're going to pay. And what if that's too low for my company to make a profit? That takes away biosimilar competition. That takes away the ability to reduce drug prices. And that really can't be argued with. We know that the biosimilar experience so far in the United States and certainly in Europe is working because of increased competition. The more competition that comes into market, the cheaper the prices get. And that is how you reduce drug prices, not by the government telling you what you're going to pay or what you're going to get paid and keeping others out of the market. So fewer choices for patients, not more choices, is what we will see. It's what was seen in Australia. And one of our members, Bowel Cancer Australia, did a webinar for us, and he says, this is not what we were promised by the government. And so we know colon cancer patients literally had a week's notice, and they lost access to the drug that was working for them when a biosimilar came into market. And that is not a good thing for patients. So really the question comes down to, is the US ready for a European style health outcome? Of the new cancer medicines, 90% are available to the US within the first year of launch. It's usually within the first 2 months of launch. You look at major countries like France, Germany, and the UK, less than half of those drugs are available to cancer patients. And look at the death rates of cancer patients as a result. Cancer death rates are 1.6 to 1.8 times higher in Europe than those in the US. And I can tell you, when you look at colon cancer specifically, Europe accounts for 10% of the world's population, accounts for 33% of the world's deaths from colon cancer. So think about that. 33% of the world's colon cancers are in Europe. Only 10% of the world's population is in Europe. So there's something wrong that has to be fixed, and it's not what we want to come to the United States, and we don't want it. We don't want to go back in time when we've come so far. So it is important that the patient community get involved in this issue. I am the only patient advocate on the panel today. It would have been great if we had 6 patient advocates talking about this, but they are getting up to speed. You'll frequently see op-eds now, like the one that is highlighted on this slide that I had run on how drug pricing will ruin our health systems. ASBM has launched a microsite, irapatientsinfo.org, that has all of the information that anyone would want to read to get up to speed on how the IRA will affect access for patients long-term. And my organization actually filed a lawsuit. We joined the National Fusion Center, which represents physicians, and we joined Pharma, which represents the industry, and we represent the patient voice. So multi-stakeholder lawsuit brought against the administration for the reasons that have been discussed on this call, because we truly believe that this law will affect future innovation. It will affect drug development, and not in a way that's good for patients. So here are some links. You can take your phones real quickly and snap these QR codes if you want to read first my op-ed. That is a link to the one of the places that picked it up was the Reading Eagle. It's been picked up in multiple states now, but you'll be able to read the op-ed here, which really outlines some good data on why the IRA is bad for patients. You can actually see the lawsuit on the second QR code. If you read that, you can read the lawsuit and read a summary of why this lawsuit was filed and what is happening with it. And then, of course, visit that website I told you about, irapatientinfo.org. That's a microsite put out by the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines. And there's a QR code for that as well. With that, I thank you for your attention. And again, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to represent the patient point of view in this whole discussion. And I will turn it back over.
Well, thank you so much, Andy. That's very helpful remarks. What I'd like to do is throw out a few questions to the panel that we've been collecting from the audience. And maybe, Andy, since you're had been speaking most recently, you could take a first crack at this first one. I'll date myself, but I graduated from medical school in 1990, and no one talked about the costs of therapy back then. You've heard, the introduction of concepts like the financial toxicity of treatment, and I know you think a lot about how to balance these issues. And so one question is, as we look at how the IRA could be modified, how it could be fixed, what can we hope for? What should we be trying to do to modify existing policies to better represent the best interests of patients?
It's a really good question, and it's so hard to fix something once it's passed. It would have been so much easier for the administration to listen to all of us stakeholders before the IRA came into play. But what has to be fixed for me first, and I'll leave that to the industry folks and to the economic experts here on this webinar. But for me, what has to be fixed is anything that stifles innovation. Whether it's the number of years of protection or whether it's just getting rid of the whole negotiation idea that you can actually negotiate with the United States government, that has to go, because number one, it's not a negotiation, it's not transparent, it's misleading, and really that provision for me is the scariest one of all of them, because when I meet with 26 pharma companies and I hear the same thing from every one of them, I don't think it's an idle threat. I think there actually is measurable pullback that is happening now across the board. And I think one of the big issues is that there's a lack of transparency in this entire IRA. There's not been a way for patients and patient voices to get involved in the policy discussion. There is not a transparency about how these prices are going to be negotiated. And there just has been a total lack of transparency across the board. And I think if you want the public to weigh in, it can't be on the sound bites that we hear in political speeches and on television. It has to be, it has to be measurable progress. And I don't think we're going to see that with the IRA. I think we're going to see measurable pullback from the industry, which is going to mean less drugs for patients. And there has to be, a more open way for patients to get involved. There is a way for patients to get involved and get the voice, but it's very complicated and complex. And it doesn't even appear that they'll take those viewpoints into account. And that's kind of why we filed this lawsuit, was the lack of transparency that the administration had, and the lack of patient input and public input in getting this law passed. But those are my initial thoughts, but I'll turn it over to the experts here to fully respond to what can we do to fix this.
And Steve, can I just kind of build off of what Andy said and allude back to something that Chuck referred to with regards to how Part D was created, and Tom and I were in the administration, in the office of the secretary, working on at the time. Just the notice and comment process alone, and the lack of notice and comment through the department. Andy references, input, what for any major change in law within the Department of Health and Human Services, you would go through a normal 90-day notice and comment process where you basically seek input from the public, obviously the patient community, obviously the industry, the provider community. And if you go through that process, and I'm sure Tom can comment on this as well, you basically seek comment because you're trying to work as partners in order to resolve issues that are more likely to be contemplated by those who are being impacted by the law than those who are going to be implementing it in general. And the fact that this, the IRA was handled through guidance, which is essentially 30 days and really not having to listen to the public, is really, to me, is a black mark on the entire process. It basically demonstrates that the administration was not really open to getting input from stakeholders. And I think that's a major problem just in terms of how it's been perceived.
We wanted to hear from the public. We went through a notice and comment process. The proposed Part D rule was issued in the summer of 2004, and we finalized it at the end of January 2005. We wanted to hear from the public. To pick up on Michael's word, we wanted to be partners with the PBMs, the Part D plans, with manufacturers, with pharmacies, with patient groups. We wanted to make sure that we got the design of the benefit correct. And it seems like with the IRA, the government doesn't want to hear from the public. They have their own fixed idea of how they're going to do this, and they deliberately, and Congress allowed them to deliberately short circuit the comment process.
Chuck, you want to add anything to that?
Sorry, I was just talking about prices that came up. Yeah, I would echo that. I think seeing the process, this was a deliberate choice. They do not want comments. They want to be able to execute the price controls as quickly as they can.
Dr. Potts, did you have any thoughts about what could fix the situation? Is there any middle ground here to refine things?
And I think in the current political realities, I do think I'm optimistic that at least the 913, I mean, this insane, but really frankly, killing off the small molecules for large populations, that I'm hope that there can be some fix there. And if I had one thing, that's what I'd focus on is moving the 913 to 1313 so that you have so that frankly, large population, small molecule drug development is sustainable.
Steve, one more thing I just want to add, and I think we heard this in some of the early presenters. I certainly have heard this as I've been out engaging with the HTA community and just generally with policymakers and stakeholders. You should look at this as a beginning of a bad law that's going to get worse. And so the idea that for those who are saying basically, we should be careful about how we implement this. And even those, I was referring to, I listened to a podcast yesterday from the Commonwealth Fund, who was basically saying we have to be very careful about the need for some guardrails because we don't really know how far this can go in terms of the impact that it has on innovation. That is an investment. There's dispute between the industry and the CBO in terms of the number of new drugs that might be affected by this. And, you really have to say, and I think it's one of the things that Thomas and I and those in the administration and Chuck, when he was on the Hill during the creation of Part D, you have to defer to the people that ultimately know best from where they're standing. So in this case, when you're talking about investment, you have to talk to the investors. You have to talk to the industry. They know better what is the impact is going to be. So it may be an unknown in that they don't know exactly how bad this can be. But at the same time, they know that they have to protect themselves. And that means they have to change their behavior. And ultimately, the number of molecules that may be affected, the different indications that may be, the degree of research that may be involved here, it's all bad. None of it is good. And I think that's the point. So those who support the law say, well, we don't think it's going to be quite as bad as others are saying. but they are acknowledging that it's going to be a problem. And ultimately, Andy's example of his own personal situation, and I can tell you that knowing Andy started the Colon Cancer Alliance back in the 90s because he lost a mother to colon cancer and a father to pancreatic cancer. And then he gave up his law practice and began doing what he's been doing since. And now he has a wife affected. So his story, his personal story, is even more than he alluded to, but it is one of, he is representative of millions and millions of people who basically could be impacted by these really bad changes to the law.
How would the panelists respond to the argument that is sometimes made that we need to try this to see what we can do to help control prices? Like, how do we know without trying this? Let's let it play out. If it undermines some innovation, the market will recover if we need to adjust things. And I'd be interested in what Dr. Potts and others might think about that approach.
I mean, I'll just quickly respond to that. I mean, if you look at, there was some examples. I mean, there's some great small molecules for lung cancer, for example, but that is it's a staircase, right? So you go back 2000 with a drug called Tarceva, which was the very first EGFR small molecule. It was good. It wasn't great. And it had lots of side effects, and nobody on this call would have said, that was the best drug ever. It's been amazing. But now it's 20 years later, and you've had the ability of investment year in and year out to continually make better and better lung cancer drugs. And so you look at Tagrisso now and some of the others that are just, they are amazing drugs, and you literally have very minimal side effects, and the quality of life is high, and the tumor is beaten back for a number of years. So that is a staircase, and that was a 20-year staircase in lung cancer. And I think what we were seeing prior to this IRA Act is those same staircases happening in pancreatic cancer, I hope in colon cancer, Andrew, some of these other areas, myeloma. It's just been amazing to see the innovation. And what you're saying is, well, let's just experiment and eliminate some of those staircases for a decade and then see what happens. I mean, that's really what we're saying is is that really what we want to do?
Yeah, and I think, Steve, just to that point, and I know Steve Potts, your conversations with Dr. Fonseca and with McInerney, the former AMA president McInerney, they both talk about it as a system that is at its height in terms of what it's reaching a potential that is a separating factor for us in the U.S. and the advantages we have. You can look to Matthias in the European system, and they will acknowledge, I think, generally that basically the system that they would rather be under would be ours, what it was prior to the IRA. And from the patient community, the provider community, basically everyone but policymakers can't really make a logical argument as to why the system that they have now under and basically proposed and moved on very quickly with little input from the public is a system that has really any benefits other than cost savings. It's very much directed at cost. And the question is, where do those cost savings accrue? And it
isn't even true cost savings, because look at something like a bladder cancer. The cost of that disease is insane when you you get your bladder taken out, and drugs that prevent that. I mean, you can point to that drug, or you can point to so many costs that are avoided, hospitalization costs. But unless you take the totality of what the drug is doing, if all you do is look at what that drug costs versus what it was replacing and other costs.
I will flag just a concern I have on that, and this goes to a broader issue, that when we talk about cost, again, from a legislative lawmaker perspective, and Tom will remember, all the decisions that Congress takes are going to be driven by the Congressional Budget Office. And while I absolutely agree and have argued over my career about the long-term value that medicines, and particularly either transformative or even curative therapies, offer, unfortunately, the framework that the Congressional Budget Office uses is a very narrow one, and it really looks primarily at what short-term expenditures are, and it doesn't take into account the long-term benefits to the healthcare system. The other part of it, going to the question of why I worry about this idea of well, we can just turn it off if it proves to be bad. That what is going to happen with the IRA price control mechanism, every year that this goes forward, the baseline assumption for the Congressional Budget Office is more drugs are subject to negotiation, and more drugs there's going to be therefore more savings to the federal government. It's going to become harder and harder year after year to unwind that, particularly as you look ahead to the fiscal challenges facing this country, both in terms of the Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, which pays for Medicare, is going to be insolvent in a handful of years. The overall debt numbers are staggering. That's only going to get worse, and that's going to put huge pressure on federal lawmakers to reduce spending, not increase it. And unfortunately, if we're talking about repealing or even mitigating the IRA, that's going to have a cost associated with it. And every year that this goes forward, that cost is going to get to be a bigger and bigger number, which is going to mean that it's going to be harder and harder to repeal.
That's a great point, Chuck.
The one of the issues that's been touched upon in the remarks today is the interrelationship between the European marketplace and the U.S. marketplace. And this analogy may be wrong, but I'll throw it out there. You know, our former administration famously approached NATO and said, you have to pay for more fair share of our military defense costs. Is there a role here for our European allies to pick up more of the innovation costs if you know, our grandmothers in Iowa are going to be paying less, or whatever's going to happen because of some of these changes? Or can we expect things to change in that direction, or is everything moving towards less and less support for innovation?
We barely even take account for Europe when we do economic planning. It's literally the U.S. market. And then my other comment would be, it's like asking a library that gets books for free, you know, to somehow pay for more of the cost of actually producing them at a bookstore. The U.S. is the bookstore and Europe's the library. I mean, so it's going to be tough to get them to own up to, frankly, they're getting free books, and it's been great.
Mateus?
Thanks, thanks, Stephen. I think that's a very astute observation. I mean, the funding has to come from somewhere, right? And I think I also in my presentation I spoke about some of the recent changes we've seen in Europe as well, where there are increased pressures put on developers of innovative drugs. So you have those pressures in Europe, you have those pressures now in the US as well. And that's does not bode well for innovation, and that's a message that we are trying to put across here in Europe as well. So we are also involved in conversation here with WHO Europe. So it's the regional office of WHO, and they had set up a stakeholder consultation. It's called the Access to Novel Medicines platform, and we were in discussions here with the governments. They said, you know, what is the richer countries such as Norway, I'm Norwegian, said, well, we cannot pay for some of these new drugs. We think that they are too expensive. We challenged them on that and said, well, okay, but someone has to pay for these. Someone has to fund the development of these drugs in the first place, and it is only fair that those that have more of a willingness, ability to pay, they pay for it. And they did concede to this and said, well, that is actually true, and this actually shows some solidarity between countries, that those that have more of a willingness to pay are able to shoulder some of those costs. So to answer the question, I think, yeah, those pressures, they don't go away, and someone will have to shoulder the cost somewhere.
Yeah, and I'd like to just jump into that point, because after Part D was passed, and it was passed, for those who remember, basically it was signed December 8, 2003, but really started implementation in 2004, and it was a presidential election year. So there was a lot of pressure politically on, as we were working to define what Part D was. And I can say at the time that I had moved from the policy shop into the public affairs shop and was dealing with the media and the press a lot. And there were a lot of questions about, why are we paying more in the United States? There was questions around importation, as an example. Why can't we import drugs? There was questions about the fact that we pay more. And the reality was, the answer in general was, we are basically carrying a lot of other countries. And at some point, nothing changed in the European system. Now is getting worse, right, Matthias, with what you guys just had come down your way in your own problems with regards to the system. And you're trying to struggle with how do we maintain innovation to the extent that we are right now in Europe. Meanwhile, now we have those pressures with us on the US side. And so the question really becomes, well, where is it going to go? Because if we start replicating the European system, we already know the impact from where you guys are with access issues compared to us. And then you have to start looking outside of the US to what is a better environment to basically allow drugs to be developed where the manufacturers have to recover that cost that they're going to lose within the US system. And eventually you're going to get squeezed out of being able to have that R&D and innovation anywhere, because the places where it exists right now, because of the fiscal pressures we've all talked about, there just aren't many options left. I keep hearing Asia as a potential place where it may go, where they may try to entice manufacturing. But obviously, it is a boon to the US system. We haven't even talked on the economic side, but just from a patient perspective, it is an advantage that we've had that allows for stories like Andy's that certainly do not exist in the European system when you start thinking about quality and other aspects of HTA that gets into looking at systems and groups rather than individuals.
Well, I see where our time is just about up, so I wanted to thank everybody for participating today. I've certainly learned a lot, and a special thanks to all of our panelists, to the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines, and to the Generics and Biosimilars Initiative. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Steve.